Ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim, avodai heim, asher otzesi osom me'eretz Mitzrayim. With this pasuk, the closing pasuk of chapter 25 in Vayikra, the Torah gives to every man and woman a title of distinction. We are all Avdei Hashem. Indeed, Moshe Rabbeinu himself, in Ba'aloscha, in Bamidbar chapter 12, is referred to as Moshe Avdi, B'chol Beisi Ne'emonhu, the loyal servant. And indeed, in our tefillas on Shabbos morning, Yismach Moshe v'matnas chelkei, ki eved ne'emon karosela. The greatest possible praise given to Moshe Rabbeinu was that he was an Eved Hashem. I'd like to have a closer look at the meaning and the implications of this title from a few different perspectives. This year has been sponsored anonymously in gratitude for Chazdei Hashem that the sponsor has experienced in their life. I'd like to just have a look at various different aspects of this. Firstly, in its context, of course, it's talking about the Yovel year. That even if somebody is sold into Avdus, sold into slavery, that slavery is finite. That slavery comes to an end in the Jubilee year in the Yovel, and the Pasuk gives a reason for it. Why is that? It's true this person has entered into what seems to be an eternal contract of servitude to somebody else, but the Torah says there are no such things as eternal contracts of servitude. Ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim, avodahem. Ultimately, everybody has this innate freedom because of the status of being an Eved Hashem. That supersedes and goes beyond any other possible claim or contract or responsibility that somebody has to another individual. Our supreme responsibility is to be Avdei Hashem. And this is expressed in many different ways. Interestingly, in the Gemara in Bab Metzia Daf Yud, it's even expressed in the halachas regulating relationships between an employer and an employee. The Gemara there's talking about somebody who is employed to do a certain work, a poyel, and halfway through the work, let's say of harvesting the field, halfway through he decides, that's it, I'm stopping this, I'm going to do something else. So he's broken his agreement with his employer, but he's done half the work. Does the employer have to pay him for the half work that he's done, given that he's left the employer in the lurch? So the halacha is in favor of the employee. And so the Gemara's paskins, poyel choze afilu b'chatzi hayom. Even if he's employed for a day and he does half a day's work, he gets paid for his half a day's work, and he's allowed to say, that's it, I'm no longer employed by you, I'm going to do something else. Why is that, says the Gemara? The Gemara says, because ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim avodaihem. Ultimately, Klal Yisrael are only Avdei Hashem, and it's true we enter into all sorts of contracts of employment and agreements with various different individuals, but they are all subject to our primary and initial contract with HaKadosh Baruch Hu as being Avdei Hashem. So it is a bit paradoxical that in a sense, when you think about the word Avdei Hashem, you think it's the ultimate servitude, but in reality, it has given the Bnei Yisrael throughout Jewish history an inner sense of being free of employers, free of host nations, free from the culture, free from outside influences, because our total inner commitment is to be Avdei Hashem, and that is the upshot of this particular pasuk. I'd like to have a look at the way this pasuk appears in a very fascinating piece of Gemara in Baba Basra Daf Yud with Rabbi Akiva in conversation with a Roman general, Turnus Rufus. And in this conversation, Turnus Rufus is saying to Rabbi Akiva, why do you give charity to poor people who are starving to death? And indeed, he's referring, if you like, metaphorically, to the Jewish people who've just gone through the destruction of the Bayis Sheni. Rabbi Akiva lived through that destruction, and Turnus Rufus himself is part of destroying the Har HaBayis and Yerushalayim, and they're having a discussion, a theological discussion about how we understand these events. And Turnus Rufus says, look, you are called Avdei Hashem, you're the servants of God. But is it not true? Imagine a king who has a servant and he's angry with his servant and he throws him into prison and tells everybody, let the man starve to death. and then you go quietly, surreptitiously, and give the servant food, won't the king be angry with you? What he's really saying is, the Mashal brings this down, that actually what we're dealing with here is the Jewish people are finished. They've been thrown out of Jerusalem, they've been thrown out of their country, subjected to the Churban twice, the Bais Rishon and the Bais Sheni. Clearly, they're no longer in favor of God. They are the servant who has been dispossessed and has been expelled. So that's the end of the Jewish people. So in fact, Tunas Rufus uses this Avdei Hashem principle as, if you like, a criticism and a sign that God is no longer interested in us. To which Rabbi Akiva turns around and says, yes, it's true we are Avdei Hashem. But let me give you a different scenario, he says. What would be if the king is angry with his son? And he throws his son into prison and says to everyone, let him starve to death. And then you go quietly and feed the son and look after him, make sure he lives. Would the king not be happy with you? And we are called Bonim Atem Lashem Elokeichem. We are the children of God. And it's true that we are Avdei Hashem, and when we are no longer behaving like it, we maybe forfeit the title of Avdei Hashem, but the title of Bonim Atem Lashem Elokeichem, as we find the Gemara in Kiddushin Lamed Vav says, Bein kach or bein kach nikru bonim. That bonim is something which can't be broken. We are bonim Atem Lashem Elokeichem. We are the children of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is eternal. That is something which, irrespective of how Klal Yisrael live and behave, that will always be true. And therefore, says Rabbi Akiva, we give tzedakah and we look after people, and the Jewish people have a future because we are bonim atim Lashem Elokeichem. And even if in the present we have been dispossessed of Israel and the Harabayas, we will come back. And this is a very fascinating conversation between the two of them. And indeed, in our tefillos, we often refer to the fact that we have a dual connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. For example, after Tkiyas Shofar and Rosh Hashanah, in the tefillah of Hayom Haras Olam, we say, Im Kavonim, Im Ka'avodim. We are sometimes like Avdei Hashem, we are sometimes Bonim Atim Lashem Elokeichem. But the link is indestructible. The connection is immutable, cannot be changed, cannot be lost. And that was really the conversation that Rabbi Akiva has with this Roman general. Interestingly, that millennia later and centuries later, this whole thesis was something which was forwarded by the Christian church, what was generally referred to as supersessionism, which was the claim that indeed the Jewish people were once the chosen people throughout biblical times, but they lost it. And because they lost it, they are no longer the chosen people. And we, must add chas v'shalom, the Christian people, have taken over. We have superseded them. Hence supersessionism. We have superseded them as the chosen people. And they have lost favor in the eyes of God because of the argument of Tunas Rufus, that they were Avdei Hashem, but an Eved can be disposed of. To which the answer is, Bonim Atim Lashem Elokeichem. The answer is that the link the Klal Yisrael have with the Jewish people is indestructible because of the link of Bonim Lashem Elokeichem, and indeed the tefillah that we have, which most concisely reflects this double connection we have to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, was authored by Rabbi Akiva himself, and that is the famous tefillah which begins with the words Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu refers to Bonim and Avodim, and this is really the underlying theme of many of our tefillahs and of our understanding of Jewish history. I'd like to add, incidentally, that in a famous talk given by Hagon Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, Zechron Livracha, in 1956, which was later on published under the title Kol Dodi Dofek. I recommended reading for everybody. It was one of his most brilliant and beautiful statements about how he understood that the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel in the 20th century was the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu showing us, and indeed showing the whole world, that Klal Yisrael had not been abandoned. That even though we have suffered greatly throughout the Golus, the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was indeed, and he goes into this a little bit, he says this is a refutation of Christian theology. a refutation. And that's indeed why the Vatican had great difficulty initially, and even to this day, in recognizing the validity of the Jewish return to the land of Israel, because the Jewish people returning to the land of Israel refutes their whole thesis of supersessionism. And in actual fact, Klal Yisrael coming back to the land of Israel is a Kiddush Hashem. Right? As the Yechezkel writes in chapter 36, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Yechezkel, I will return the Jewish people to the land of Israel, lo lemanchem, not because you deserve it, but lema'ani, l'shem kodshi, this chalel, that Jewish people living under the dominion of the other nations of the world constitutes a type of chilul Hashem, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Yechezkel. And therefore they have to be restored to the land of Israel as a Kiddush Hashem, as a refutation of any suggestion that Klal Yisrael have been rejected by HaKadosh Baruch Hu and been lost. And all this whole conversation, interestingly, is summed up in this amazing dialogue between Rabbi Akiva and Tunas Rufus in Baba Basra Daf Yud, and contains a beautiful understanding of this pasuk, Avod Ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim avod. Indeed, we pride ourselves in this distinctive accolade of being Avdei Hashem, the servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And even when we don't live up to that title completely, we are still Bonim Atem LaHashem Elokeichem, the children of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we receive Chazdei Hashem way beyond what we ever deserved. And that is really the secret of the eternity of Klal Yisrael, and that is indeed the message that Rabbi Akiva wanted to leave to all later generations. V'chein yehi ratzon.